the hell is going on?
Welcome to the Exposing Mold podcast. My name is Keely Severson, and I'm here with my co-host Eric Johnson. Alicia Swami will be joining us shortly. Today we are here with Dr. Jess Peatross, MD. Dr. Jess, thank you so much for joining us. You are under fire. Please, what's going on?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you guys asked, because the more people that know about this, the more people that can bring scrutiny to what is not ethical, if you will. Before I say anything else, I'd like to preface this by saying legality does not equal morality. And so I think a lot of people have seen that for themselves in the last couple of years of everything that's going on. I feel like we are the silent majority. So when I say this, I'm going to trust that people can see my heart and the fact that I was trying to do no harm and follow the Hippocratic Oath as a doctor. And when you do that, that doesn't always mean you go along with the mainstream. That means you speak up in the face of evil or pseudoscience, what we think is tobacco science. And so when I was in California, I was doing medical exemptions for fragile children. This was back in 2017, 18. And they passed SB 276, which narrowed what we could do exemptions down to 4 things like family history of leukemia, lymphoma, seizures, autism, some neurologic issues, things like this. And we followed the law strictly. Myself and a pediatric naturopath, Dr. Ilana Rumel, we followed this routinely. And what's happened now is the California Medical Board is going back and retroactively punishing doctors for following SB 276. Then they passed SB 277, which no one could do exemptions at that point. No doctors will do it. If you do 5 or more, they automatically open an investigation on you to suspend or revoke your license. So now our hands are tied and they're actually retroactively punishing us for 4 or 5 years back. And there's been probably 20, 30 doctors ahead of me, including Dr. Bob Sears, Dr. Paul Thomas, Dr. Ken Stoller, who's still an active court case, who are really under fire and have been punished or put on probation. And many people ask, why is this happening? If we get put under reprimand or probation or any sort of disciplinary action, this nulls all other vaccine exemptions we've done for fragile children. And so that's, in my opinion, the ultimate goal. I think most people who hear this story would feel the same. And I don't want to go into the science of anything here. I think people can see that forced mandates are never good at this point. People don't appreciate forced mandates. They appreciate freedom of choice, which is what this country was built on. And I don't want to politicize this at all, because freedom of choice is an inherent human right. It has nothing to do with politics, nothing. And I'm sorry this issue of health has been politicized, but the truth of the matter is that our children and the parents, we are in a very fearful state. And in California now, and in the CDC recommended schedule, there's 72 doses of vaccines before the age of 18. Now that's drastically changed since the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and our grandparents grew up. Yet we have a sicker nation. We have a higher, SID, sudden infant death syndrome, higher, one of the worst birth rates in industrialized countries. That's what we're number 1 in. And so we have more vaccinations. We have more high-tech, quote-unquote, science, and yet a sicker, more chronically ill country. So I need people to understand logically what's going on here. And so I feel as though many of us doctors felt that we were doing what was best for the children. I don't feel that blanket medicine is good for anyone. We wouldn't go around and say metformin is right for everyone. Everyone has different genes. They're bio-individual. If we want to make this about science, we need a double-blind study of vaccinated versus unvaccinated, which they will never do because they say it's unethical. How is this not unethical then? How is it not? And so my heart is broken for all the fragile children in California, because I feel regardless of where you stand on this issue, I don't want to be labeled pro or anti. That's small mindset. It's not what it's about. It's about freedom of choice, and someone should have the choice to decide whether they agree with something injected in their body or not. I think we're in a state of mass psychosis and groupthink right now, where everyone is so polarized toward a certain issue that we forgot about independent thought. People are inept that are in charge. So I just feel like it's time for a new dawn. If they're going to persecute us for what we felt, what we were doing right, then there's suits and lawyers persecuting us, by the way, on the board, suits and lawyers. I didn't ever talk to a doctor. So if that's going to happen to me, then I think the people deserve to know. And forgive them if they choose to slander me. I hope that's not where this goes. I hope they choose to see my heart and the fact that at that point in time, I was doing what I felt was best, just like my other fellow doctors that I know personally at this point. So I think really it's time for a new dawn. It's time for a new accreditation system. It's time for doctors to stand up and say what they really feel. Because I know doctors who feel like I do and they're afraid to stand up. I get it. This is freaking scary. But I still have a responsibility in the face of fear. And that's what's happening right now. That's a really long answer to what you guys asked, but that's the truth.
Yeah, I feel that philosophically, when you talk about the freedom of choice, that this is a whole new age of humanity, because even though there have been vaccines and interventions in the past that have altered the course of our evolution and how our human species interacts, fits in on this planet, this is a whole new step where from now on, it's like you have to have this treatment, this intervention in order to establish your right to exist on this planet. All the people who refuse, who want to live a natural life, are now outcasts.
It's the Hunger Games. Literally. Didn't they prep us for this one with all those shows and movies, huh?
I cannot tell you how many times I have said, this feels like the epilogue of the Hunger Games. Like, this is how they made the districts.
You should see the World Economic Forum. Klaus Schwab, in his German voice, said, "You will own nothing and be happy," in 2030. And by 2050, they want us all congregated into 13 cities, no rural areas. So it's more real than you think. And this was on the World Economic Forum. I'm not talking about a conspiracy theory here. So, I mean, this was all, I can't tell you how much I can see people who are in power or in places that people view as power who are making completely what appears to be illogical decisions to the mass populace at this point in time. They look crazy sometimes by what's going on. People are really questioning. And I hope that what's going on with us doctors, especially in California, I hope that the other doctors can see the error in this. This is what I pray for. And that they can say, gosh, this is a wave that if we don't say something now, it could change forever. And we could really our hands could be tied in the name of, in the guise of safety and health safety, and take certain freedoms away at this point.
It truly is weird, like some kind of mass Stockholm syndrome.
Yes. Yes.
Well, I've been wondering how to get people to question. I mean, it looks like just the VAERS, the adverse reporting system alone should be enough to convince people that it's high risk with little gain. I mean, children are not really the ones who are suffering from this. So,
They're coming for the kids.
Yeah, in a big way. And one thing that's been reported in Spain and several other countries now is a really abnormal behavior of the red cells on microscopy, the rouleau formation.
Correct. I actually had the absolute pleasure of co-hosting a podcast interview with Dr. Ryan Cole, who is the chief medical officer of America's Frontline Doctors. And his trade by training is a pathologist, which means he looks at histologic slides under a microscope and gets to see all this, right? And it was very disturbing when I asked him what he'd seen since, COVID and vaccination started, 300% increase in endometrial cancers and odd shaped rouleau formations with red blood cells that had distorted morphology at this point. And he had seen, he has a very unique perspective because he gets to look at the body under a microscope and see what's going on cellularly, which is really important. So if, Dr. Ryan Cole was an excellent interview, and he gave me excellent perspective on a different level about that. Exactly what you're saying.
I remember years ago, there were advertisements on television that show what healthy red cells look like. They're nice little platelets and they all dance around with good Brownian motion. And now we're seeing something completely different. Abnormal clotting, behavior red cells stacking up when they shouldn't. This is something that one can clearly see under a microscope. How could anybody fail to be alarmed by this?
Exactly. And, if you talk to a lot of the doctors in the hospitals and things, they'll talk about DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulation, which is a form, a hallmark of sepsis, if you will. And often means the patient is having qualities of bleeding as well as clotting issues at the same time. So clotting and bleeding sort of simultaneously is very difficult to treat properly because they're antagonistic treatments or solutions. And so this is a hallmark of sepsis when the body's really under fire. And this is another hallmark of COVID infection, according to them too. And so it looks like similar things that the infection causes, the vaccine also has those side effects too, right?
Yeah. And if the clotting weren't scary enough, just knowing that this abnormal rouleau formation is happening means that oxygen is not being delivered properly to the cells.
Correct. Exactly. And that's what we're seeing a lot of is patients who are saying they're fine and their oxygen sats are much lower, and they're crapping out early because they're pooping out early because they can't keep up with the demands where they're not properly oxygenating. Mm-hmm.
So this jab is a clear and present danger to the future of humanity.
If you look at the reporting on VAERS years prior to 2020, 2021, when the vaccine really got ramped up, it wasn't even close to the reporting there is now. I mean, last time I looked, 19,000 deaths reports. I can't even remember at this point. I have to go back and look, but it's startling that the cases of myocarditis. And so, this is something that is being drastically ignored because people say, oh, theirs is a passive reporting system. What they fail to tell you is that it's also a federal crime to misreport on VAERS. And so this is also the way the CDC tracks vaccine safety. So it has some sort of merit here. According to a Harvard study, only 1% of adverse events are reported to vaccine adverse event surveillance system, reporting system. And so, when you think about if that's possibly true, which it is hard to report on there, it is. And, many doctors say, oh, don't, because they're afraid. So what are we missing here? I don't know if we can quantify or qualify it. We don't know. We don't know.
And the other thing on top of all this is by programming the immune system to produce a specific spike protein profile for the original COVID, you increase the chances for vaccine escape, where any stimulation of the immune system will cause this particular pattern of antibodies to be produced, so you are less able to compensate for the variants.
Correct. Yeah, you're talking about antibody-dependent enhancement, or ADE for short, and you guys can absolutely type that in with the letters NCBI, which will pull up all PubMed published studies. And you can research it yourself. You can do leaky vaccine, NCBI, which is what this vaccine is, and look up and see what that is. But antibody-dependent enhancement, that is definitely what you're doing when you're getting the injection. I don't even really want to call it vaccine, an injection, is you're telling your body to produce antibodies against a specific part of the virus, which is the spike protein. It's not the whole virus. The viruses are intelligent. They quickly mutate. to get around things. And so a lot of the mutations are actually due to the vaccine, not the unvaccinated. And so once you start making a certain spike protein to a certain part of a certain virus, you know, what the vaccines they're getting now are to a variant that's likely dead in the United States. It's moved on to Mu, Delta, you know, now Omicron. And so these things mutate quickly. So if your body is only making a certain antibody to a certain part of the virus that's not even a variant in the country anymore, are you going to be able to mount the proper response? We've also completely left out discussions about T cell immunity. Or our innate immunity. At 30 to 40% of children are suspected to have immunity to COVID-19 based on T cell immunity. I know I likely did. I had COVID for 2 days. It felt like I was poisoned because I was nauseous and had this weird chicken skin and was fatigued, but it was gone. I couldn't smell a thing either, but it was like I was poisoned. You know, but people forget about T cell immunity or crossover immunity, which if you've had, you know, a coronavirus or a variant of that in the years past, you might still have crossover immunity. In fact, one study showed that people who had MERS or SARS back 20 years ago, I think like 80% of them had crossover T cell immunity to COVID-19, which means we've forgotten about one half of our immune system that's able to also fight this virus. We're focusing only on antibodies to a virus that mutates. And then what are we doing to the immune system, the antibody producing side of their immune system?
Yeah, a study of the 1918 Spanish flu showed that people still had immunity 90 years later.
Wow, I had not heard that. Wow. That's awesome.
It really is. I mean, the immune system is incredible if we would just let it do its job.
And let me say something else. I mean, the whole interview thus far has been controversial. Let's just continue that trend. What if your immune system is part God? Because God created it. What if that is us mocking God? What if the ancient texts were a little bit cracked in the energy they saw in the present day about how man would try and mock God and the masses would miss it and have their faith elsewhere in something man-made rather than something God-given or part God, which why is our immune system not the most amazing thing ever created that you've ever seen or heard of? It's pretty remarkable. It's as remarkable as the stars and the universe and the planets. Think about how intricate it is. And if people only knew or educated on that, they might be awed and have a different perspective. And so I just really see a very spiritual war between good and evil going on right now. It's very clear to me.
Well, if anybody remembers the H.G. Wells story, War of the Worlds, how the aliens could not survive on the planet because their immune systems could not adapt, whereas by virtue of evolution, humans had, just because we survived, survival of those who made it through all the challenges of the past, we earned a birthright to exist on this planet by a million generations, millions of years of evolution. And now we are sacrificing that. We are giving it up to live an artificial lifestyle. And from now on, if we buy into this program, our future is entirely dependent on the ability of man to play God.
Right? It's in the Matrix in real life. Like that was a documentary, because that's really what we're heading into is transhumanism, which is demonic, if I might say. That is the way of the demon is transhumanism, which is leveraging and cashing in on the public as the fourth industrial revolution, which is what they're trying to do.
And if one wants to set aside the spiritual aspect, one can just think of this in terms of we are decreasing our ability to adapt to challenges in the future.
Oh, a life of comfort and convenience is another way of saying it, I think, right?
Yeah, I very much fear for the future of our species because this is just a dangerous path, and science has shown that they are very capable of making mistakes for which there is no correction.
Absolutely. I mean, it's sort of when you say a life of convenience and going down the tech life, I think about, all these biohacks that people do that they say are great for your health now, like saunas and cold plunges. Listen, that's literally the life you're supposed to live, kids. not supposed to get up in your like air conditioned, set to 72-degree home, or, you know, heated home, and it just be not a stressor, minute stressor on your body every day. You're supposed to get up and jump in a cold ass river, excuse my French, and be like, bah, and freak out and freeze, and your body turns on cold shock proteins and adapts better to the environment. Or you're sweating all day and hot and you're sweating out toxins and you're adapting and you're turning on heat shock proteins, which give your proteins that are misfolded that code for genes. It's a different way to fold properly. So that's the life we're supposed to live in nature, but we've adapted and we're scared to leave our refrigerators or air conditioned or heated homes. And what's that doing to our ability to adapt and to an environment and possibly see the truth about what's going on too?
Yeah, I believe that I got COVID over a year ago while I was backpacking the Tahoe Rim Trail.
Oh, wow.
So 170 miles completely around the circumference of Lake Tahoe. And in the middle of it, I got horribly sick. It was sort of a weird flu-like illness, a lot of gastrointestinal upset. And of course, most bizarre of all, I completely lost my sense of taste and smell.
Me too. Same. Yep.
And it's like I've never experienced anything like that before. So this is probably COVID.
Yeah.
And
Nothing.
yet,
You can't mistake it. You cannot.
but what was surprising to me is, other than that, how mild it was.
Right.
And I wonder if the reason why it was so mild for me is because I was out in nature, free of chemicals, contaminants, toxic mold, and just the ability to lead my immune system free to deal with the problem meant that I could skate through it with no problem whatsoever.
And that's amazing. I'm sure that had something to do with it. My first thought was, how did you get that out there? You know what I mean? Out on the trail. That's crazy. But then you brought it back around and said, but it was probably lesser on me because I was out in nature. Do you mind me asking a personal question about if you're vaccinated or not?
I am not.
Okay, perfect.
I have no intention.
Perfect. I just wanted your audience to hear. Me neither. And I had it for 2 days.
Yeah, I really consider this treatment to be an unlawful and immoral intervention in the entire future of humanity.
I've talked to Amazon workers who've dropped stuff off of my house and restaurant workers, and I can usually get them to say, yeah, I got the vaccine, but I didn't want to. I had to because of work. And I feel like that's the majority of people, and they don't appreciate being told what to do when most of them may trust their body and feel that they are not at risk. And I think, who am I to tell them that their body intuition is incorrect? Who am I? And now most of the studies have proven that there isn't asymptomatic spread. You have to be around someone sick. So if you're sick, you stay home. That's what should happen. So, I really think good for you, Eric, for having COVID for like a day or two.
Well, the other thing that people don't understand is that if this treatment limits the severity of the illness, but does not control contagion, then the people who would otherwise be immobilized are going to be up and about spreading it. Theoretically, by everything the CDC has told us, all this jab does is increase the pandemic, not decrease it.
Correct. And I think they've had to backtrack on a lot of things they originally said. So why California just went under mask mandate again is beyond me.
Yeah, these politicians are completely out of control.
I think people are seeing it, and I hate that we have to get this dark for people to wake up and understand what's going on. I mean, one of my favorite memes I saw around Thanksgiving was, this Black Friday, I hope you bought a big screen big enough to see what's really going on. I mean, how many athletes and young children have to get myocarditis or pass out on an athlete field before people are like pissed off about it? Our ancestors were revolting about a tax on tea. What happens?
Yeah, what happened?
I mean, all the endocrine disruptors, right? Plastics and phthalates and all the endocrine disruptors that mess up our hormones. I mean, I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, but everyone knows if you have an aggressive dog, the first thing you do to mellow it out is neuter it.
Well, one curious thing is I'm at Lake Tahoe. I'm
Mm-hmm.
a survivor of the original chronic fatigue syndrome outbreak. And because of my chronically active elevated antiviral enzymes, everybody wondered, well, what's going to happen to people who had the chronic fatigue syndrome? Are they going to be immune suppressed? Are they all going to drop dead? And that was the conventional wisdom, is that I'll probably be more susceptible. I see no signs of that whatsoever. This went through and there were no reports of this adversely affecting anybody who survived that outbreak.
Wow. That's really good information. Like, you're telling me so much that I don't know right now. That's really good information because I myself might have not had that faith in that population. I have to be honest, because in my research, I've noted that, we'll tie it around to mold now. Mold kind of spins the body into a chronic fatigue situation by attacking mitochondria first and foremost, and a lot of the way SIRS can spin the immune system is very similar to the way COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 can spin the immune system in a similar fashion, in this cytokine storm. So it's almost like, people who are living in mold or have biotoxin illness often are the long forgotten long haulers before COVID came around. And so I've been concerned about this population because if they do have somewhat of a long hauler syndrome or cytokine storm and are stuck in a SARS type of pattern, what is an exposure to something, a virus on top of that has the potential to exacerbate that side of the immune system as well? What does that do to those people? So you just kind of like showed me something, I guess.
Well, I guess you haven't seen my story.
Mm-mm.
I'm in Dr. Shoemaker's books
Ah,
because I was selected as a prototype for the Holmes 1980 chronic fatigue syndrome. And I initially refused because I had seen a pattern immediately that the people who descended into the chronic form of this post-viral illness were all in moldy buildings.
mm.
And I initiated a strategy of what I call mold avoidance, and I was getting better. And by the time of the creation of the syndrome, when Dr. Paul Cheney asked me to volunteer as a prototype, I said, well, I'm already improving to the point where I no longer qualify as a good representative of the chronic condition, thanks to mold avoidance. He said, well, that won't matter. That's okay because you have the immune abnormalities. And people don't know that chronic fatigue syndrome was actually coined on the basis of immune abnormalities, not for fatigue.
Yep,
The CDC kind of kept that secret.
of course.
But I went ahead and agreed on the basis that when researchers came to ask how this strange mystery illness came about, why the syndrome was coined, I could tell them about the sick buildings, how it was affecting people, and we could study this and determine if really toxic mold was making the difference between recovery from a virus or going on to a lifetime of being sick forever.
Oh, I already know the answer. I feel like, yeah, I know. Oh no, I didn't know your story. Thank you for sharing. That's, you remind me of that quote by Rumi that says the cracks are where the light enters. And so you had to go through a pretty horrific situation of your own but then you revolutionized it for doctors and other people. You alchemized it.
Well, I do my best.
Well, that's pretty good. Bravo.
But the original outbreak, it was brought back to Incline Village by a marathon runner who had been in China.
Huh.
How extraordinary is that?
Huh.
People are saying, well, hopefully this long COVID will shine a light on ME/CFS and we'll learn more about chronic fatigue syndrome. And yet nobody seems to remember that this began with a marathon runner from China.
Mm-hmm.
It could very well be the parallel situation. And what I would believe I was seeing is that people who were in these sick buildings, they were immune compromised by the toxic mold. And they, in essence, created immune escape with stronger variants because the people who caught the virus from those who had been in the sick buildings were just as severe as the original outbreak. Whereas if they caught the illness from people who were healthy, immune competent, not in sick buildings, they had a milder form. And eventually, when enough people, enough healthy people weakened the virus using their competent immune system to disable the mutations, the outbreak died away just as mysteriously as it had happened.
Wow. You know, I've always gotten these intuitive hits and knowing from seeing, you know, I'm definitely online known as the mold doctor. I see a lot of mold patients, a lot of people who think they have mold issues, right? A lot of times it's just bacteria and endotoxins from water damaged buildings as well that we don't talk about as much. But your story reminds me, and what you found reminds me of the saying, a dirty terrain makes a dirty germ. Because, you know, we're made up of bacteria and viruses and everything else. But if your body's out of homeostasis, your immune system is out of normalcy, which is basically what you're saying, it's sort of spitting out. And so you're a little bit more vulnerable. Things can go haywire in the body. Communication there's not proper communication. Cell to cell cytokine activity is even skewed. And so during that time, you're not only vulnerable, but the communication between viral components inside the body is off as well. Viruses are our friends, guys. We have a human virome too. So in my opinion, it's very interesting. I totally agree with what you're saying. And it makes sense that they had like mutant viruses basically that caused healthy people to become sick, right? Am I hearing that correctly?
Well, in the initial run, the primary form of the flu-like illness that came from China, everybody had the similar disease, similar severity, similar presentation. It was all the same. If you look at Dr. Cheney and Dr. Peterson in various documentaries, they say, yeah, everybody lit up and they all said it was the same thing. And then very strange things happened where some people were getting worse. And we obviously wanted to know the pattern. Why are some people getting worse? And that's when it came out that it was the people in the sick buildings who were getting worse, whereas people who were not in the sick buildings, all the schools, all the businesses that were in good buildings, these people either tended to get a milder form, or over time, the illness grew less and less until it just faded away and became nothing more than a case of food poisoning.
Wow.
So I think if you look back at the original chronic fatigue syndrome outbreak, it was so well documented that you can see all the patterns for immune escape caused by the suppression of the toxic mold. All the classic pattern, it's all there. Still clear for anybody to see if they only examine the circumstances. So naturally, I'm curious about the same thing. Are we going to see people in sick buildings who are coming out with the same or even more virulent form of this COVID-19?
Yeah, and I definitely have put that out there to my audience online on social media. And, you know, it's a very scary thing for a lot of people, and my heart goes out to them, and I don't have a good answer for, you know, I'm stuck in mold and I can't leave. And it's the worst, you know. I definitely don't want to strike fear in people with that sentiment, but I also want you guys to know that you deserve to live in a mold-free environment. You deserve that. I don't have the answers for how to get out, and I don't have answers for nitty-gritty details about financial stuff, but I promise you deserve to not live in that environment. And you can be well. And what we're trying to tell you here is not to scare you, but to tell you that it's not your body's fault. The majority of the time people think they're broken, and it's the environment they live in. It's the environment. Don't ever forget about your environment.
Yeah, unfortunately, one has to be a little bit scared. I went out and wound up sleeping in my truck.
Did you? Oh,
It's
Man,
what I had to do.
how long did you sleep there?
Well, when I realized the benefits of being completely mold free, I got a camper and it became sort of a full-time lifestyle for me.
So I love that though, because there's so many people that just need to be brave to do that. They can. You just need to be brave and do something different. And mold can get you stuck in this habit of, we've shown a lot of hoarders have circular thinking patterns because of mold in their environment. A lot of mental illness, so circular thinking that keeps you trapped can be because of your moldy environment. I don't know, Eric, did you feel different mentally? Like you could adapt to change in the environment more when you were avoiding mold?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, it made all the difference in the world. But
Yeah.
of course, here was a clear etiological clue to the mystery illness, why people were becoming chronically ill as opposed to recovering. So I wanted to pursue this and spread the word about it. And I wanted to find out exactly, if at all possible, what this black mold was. And I went back and I got a sample of it and I sent it to mold testers. They identified the mold in the sick buildings where the clusters occurred as being Stachybotrys chartarum.
The worst. I hate it.
Yeah, if the mold was Aspergillus or Penicillium or any of the others, Cladosporium, people weren't affected so badly. But when it was Stachybotrys, it was like deadly.
Oh, it's the worst. Yeah, it's awful.
What do you think about Dr. Shoemaker's shift in focus to actinomycetes?
I think he's dead on right. I do. I don't always agree on everything that Dr. T. Shoemaker says. I madly respect him. I think he is brilliant. I think he thinks outside the box, and I think he doesn't care what people think, which is super admirable. So I have nothing bad to say at all. I just have a different way, I guess, about the way I treat people. But I think he's brilliant on the actinomyces. I mean, it's absolutely found in most water damaged homes, I think more so than even mold he's discovered. And then the genie that he's using is brilliant. And so I think he is convincing medical doctors of the damages of biotoxin illness and sick building syndrome, which, oh, we need so bad. We need that so bad. And I mean, I learned a lot, I use EnviroBiomedics as the ERMI test for people, and they test a lot of endotoxins from LPS and gram-negative bacteria in the home. So he taught me about actinomyces, though, which just for the audience is a soil-based bacteria that I guess you wouldn't think would always be in your home.
Well, I have looked in the literature and found that ever since World War II, actinomycetes have shown up in endotoxins as being problematic, and nobody's quite sure why. So they were asking for a study for pretty much the same time period that people were asking for research into toxic mold. And for 20 years, Dr. Shoemaker was very interested in toxic mold. That was his primary focus. And he pursued the relationship between chronic fatigue syndrome, the official Holmes 1988 chronic fatigue syndrome, and this mold. And as it turns out, Stachybotrys was documented in the original clusters. We found it. So this was reported, but actinomycetes were not.
I see.
So this was leveraged. Not only is this a fascinating toxic black mold that we can learn a lot about, but this was political leverage for getting our foot in the door, for getting researchers to respond, because it was a documented clue in this famous mystery. And ever since 2019, Dr. Shoemaker, with his shift to endotoxins, has stepped so far away from toxic mold that there's been no mention of it. And this ability to use this one toxic mold as leverage to get the CDC, NIH to respond is kind of laying by the side of the road, unused.
Yeah, I think I would love to see that acknowledged by the government, because the way we are building buildings is a huge part of the problem. I think you'd agree with that. A lot of the building materials and a lot of the VOCs, adhesives, gypsum, all that stuff is just attracting and letting some of these LPS endotoxins grow. I would love to see the government acknowledge that and us get bills passed because of education, which I think is the direction he's going in, isn't it?
Well, unfortunately, it seems to be a direction that a lot of people have problems with, because most of his shoemaker certified doctors have left, formed
Oh,
their own organization, and are not following his protocols.
oh, I see. Yeah, I
Even
see.
his closest associates, such as Dr. Heyman, have said that Dr. Shoemaker had a good start with his emphasis on toxic mold, but now they've kind of moved on from his pioneering initial work and have branched out into other modalities.
Hmm.
But unfortunately, if you think about it, the reason Dr. Shoemaker created a certification system is so they would adhere to his rigid protocols. When one deviates, theoretically, they should, and they went back to their old ways, they should surrender their shoemaker certification.
Yeah, they should. That's true. I agree with that. Yeah.
But since Dr. Shoemaker has a new focus that does not really include mentioning the toxic black mold Stachybotrys, I've kind of gone my own way and am raising awareness of how this was a factor in the chronic fatigue syndrome, and it's still one that we can study.
1000%. Absolutely. And I think that mycotoxins in general is such a new field. We've really just scratched the surface because there's really 300 different mycotoxins. Many of them do not cause human disease that we know of, but there's many we don't even know about. So it's still,
Absolutely.
right? It's fairly new.
And are you familiar with Cheryl Harding's work on Stachybotrys skeletons?
Oh no, do tell.
Well, it emerged that if you strip the structure of the spores and fragments of all their toxins, leaving only the bare framework, these alone can create pulmonary hemorrhage.
Yikes.
So Dr. Shoemaker has been talking about the focus on mycotoxins as being misguided and a bit of a mistake. It's very possible that part of the reason for this is when they're picking up genetic activations from mycotoxins, they're missing the boat on what the structure, the skeletons are doing.
Interesting. It reminds me of the spirochetal elements left behind in Lyme disease that can still cause an immune reaction within the joints and synovial fluid. This is very well known. There might not be an active infection, but exoskeletons of the bacteria left that actually can cause activation of the immune system. So same thing, really.
Yeah, the pattern recognition.
Correct.
Yeah, it was amazing how the Lymerix vaccine actually created the disease they were attempting to eradicate.
Right. Yeah. They just
And
thirdly.
doctors were saying, well, this can't happen because we didn't use a live bacteria. But it was happening.
Yes.
And it was exactly for the reason you say. Something about the immune response to the vestigial elements was still enough to create that identical type of reaction, that same illness.
Correct. It's just very interesting. I mean, we really don't completely understand how the body works. And hence, I was going to say, third leading cause of death is medical error in this country, in the United States. So half the time, if we just left things alone, it might be better off, honestly.
It's fascinating how we have these parallel situations with the treatment, with the Lymerix conceptual framework, and with the mold conceptual framework, how this sets up a mindset that points doctors in a certain direction, which actually misleads them from other critical components of what might actually be going on.
The way to a man may seem correct, but in the end, it is death. I'm going to quote scripture again here, even though I'm not religious. You'd think you know better, but there's some real truth there, because ultimately everyone is really doing the best they can. I truly believe that, but There is, like we said earlier, mass psychosis, groupthink, Stockholm syndrome.
You know, it's fascinating to me that when Dr. Gary Holmes and the CDC, Dr. Carlos Lopez, who was the head of the CDC's viral division back in those days, when they realized that something was going on that they didn't understand, they wrote up a brief proposal to select a dozen people with the mystery illness and just study them to death, just follow them, whatever happened to them, study this small group. And unfortunately, the NIH had reason to want to suppress this scary outbreak, and they gave the syndrome a really stupid name. They implied that the major issue was all about chronic fatigue. And by derailing investigation into this, all the information that otherwise could have been gained was lost because no CFS researchers ever came back to find out what the original mystery illness was all about.
It's mind-blowing. A lot of these things I find out, the more the curtain is pulled back, the more I wonder. It's really hard to believe it's unintentional. And I feel like, how sweet are human beings? We are so naive. We would think no one would do that to us. No one would mislead us like that. How sweet, how naive are we? It's such a kind thing to think. But it's time that we all grow up and put our big boy and girl pants and panties on and say, hey, look, there might be some more, not a positive or true to intention view here. Are people really helping when they say they're helping? And come on.
Yeah. Are the good people really good?
Yeah. I mean, I want freedom from safety. I don't know about you guys.
Yeah, I was interested in the sociological aspect of how the medical profession behaves. So I went to many officials, top doctors, prominent researchers, explain the same story that I've told you, and I expected that they would pass this on to their colleagues so that we could address some of the mistakes that were made. And there are many of these people walking around acting like they are good researchers, doing their best to solve this mystery, and yet they know this, and they are not telling people.
More than we'd want to admit, unfortunately, upper ranks, I'm sorry to say. And it's, yeah, people don't want to believe that. It's uncomfortable. It affects them personally. They don't want to see the truth, but we need people to, what good is it if you're awake if you're not even out of bed yet? We need people to start speaking up.
Yep.
Dr. Peatross, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I just want your response on this. What would you say to somebody who, let me pull up the quote. What would you say to somebody who is referencing mold as only a political problem and says that since we know how to kill and remove mold, the problem is already solved?
I don't know if it's necessarily a political problem. I can see how people would feel that way. That's a very well thought out question. And I can see how people would definitely feel that way. I think that we do know how to kill and remediate mold. And when we move away from nature and more towards quicker, easier shortcuts and building things, building homes exposed to the elements, it's absolutely ridiculous. Then we are asking for things. What we need is better education in all areas of our life, including how to live independently and build homes and grow our own food, in my opinion. So I think that we have relied on people for too long. And at this point, it's up to us. So although I respect this person's opinion possibly and where they're going with us, the same people that got us into this position, we can't rely on to get us out of it, sadly.
Eric, I'd like to ask you the same question for your response, and I will repeat it because you may not have heard it. Eric, what would your response be to somebody who said mold is just a political problem and the problem is essentially solved because we know how to kill and remove mold?
Well, that's completely absurd. mold is far more than a political problem. It's a health problem. It's a health hazard, and it's used as a political tool. I will certainly admit that, but it's politics to say that you can simply clean up mold, you can remove the spores and fragments, vacuum it up, and assert beyond all doubt that the problem is solved, because there are so many of us who say, wait a minute, we are so reactive to the residual effects, to the contaminated possessions, that it is not being cleaned up that easily. Removing spores and fragments does not always fix the problem. Most of the time it does, but there are those of us who've reacted to contaminated possessions after the most aggressive cleaning. And doctors should listen to us, because this indicates that there's something beyond their conceptual framework. Toxins seem to be, or some substance from the mold is being embedded, adhering even to non-porous objects. We clean as much as we can, and yet we still feel it. That tells us there's more to be researched here, and it's politics to refuse to look at this because of their assertion that cleaning spores and fragments is definitely going to take care of that.
So problem is not solved.
The problem is not.
Thank you for that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on today's podcast episode of Exposing Mold. We had the honor of interviewing Dr. Jess Peatross, who is taking a stand for vulnerable children in California. Dr. Peatross, we are honored to have the time to interview you today, and if there's anything that we can do to continue to support your efforts or help to get the word out or publicize any of your outreach efforts, please know that you have an ally here at Exposing Mold, and thank you for your time.